Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's just terrific to see everybody here. This is our third formal session of the LHS Collaboratory. We had our organizational kickoff meeting and our first seminar presentation last year. And now we are into the new year, and this is our second seminar presentation. And we will be having more, and we will also be, excuse me, beginning our activities to initiate the work groups, which we discussed at our kickoff, and I'll be saying a few words about the work groups, very few words about the work groups in just a minute. The main order of business today is the presentation by Mike Dorsch, which will ensue immediately after I make a few more short remarks. So this is the plan for today. We're looking forward to Mike's presentation. I think you, those of you who were there at the kickoff meeting, which was in October, remember that there was quite a bit of enthusiasm in the room among the 100 or so people who were there for the idea of channeling work to move across the university, the LHS agenda forward through work groups. Doug Van Houweling and I seeded the idea of the work groups with a few specific proposals for what might be the foci of the work groups, and then some of you responded both on site and then subsequently in the feedback sheets and in more informal subsequent discussions. And we have evolved to an initial model of 5 work groups, one on socio-technical infrastructure for the learning health system, one on ethical, legal, and social policy, aka ELSI issues relating to the learning health system. And I know that many of you were at the workshop held in, I'm having trouble with months, November, 2 for 2. In November, that Jody Platt and her colleagues organized on ELSI issues in the learning health system, and that one was that event was so successful that we're now thinking that's going to be perhaps the first annual event in a series of workshops that will go forward on a regular basis. The third work group will be focused on a dream that I think a lot of us have, that the interest and talent across the campus in learning health systems could be the basis for acquiring some very large-scale funding to move this agenda forward, either from a government source like the NSF, or perhaps from a private foundation, or even a donor interested in what we are doing. So the third work group will focus on large-scale funding. The fourth on organizations and business models, which are a key component function of learning health systems, and then the fifth on matters of implementation and process. We are working now on developing draft charters for each of these 5 working groups, and we are also taking stock of the fact that many of you have indicated your interest in participating in one or more of these working groups, and the numbers of persons who have so indicated such interests are on the right column of the table that you have in front of you. There is some dual representation of the same individual in these counts, and we're delighted that some folks are interested on being participants in more than one working group. And of course, this is not a closed shop. There will be ample opportunity for folks who have not yet signed up to participate in these working groups to do so in the future. We are going to identify a chair and co-chair for each working group. We've had good luck in the past in efforts like this with dual leadership models. So the process of identifying chairs, leadership chairs and co-chairs for each work group will be one of these processes where we will exercise our intuition about who might be interested and approach those people, some of whom will be and some of whom won't be. But let me also at this time issue an open invitation for anyone who would like to participate in one of these work groups in a leadership role, to please let us know of that interest. If you're interested, we will be very interested to know of your interest. We'll be developing policies for how these work groups will work, and this will be reflected in some overarching policies and also in a charter for each work group. Lisa Ferguson, who loves to set ambitious deadlines, and we like that. Pardon me? Yes, doing her project manager thing by setting ambitious deadlines, and we like that. Has set a target for kickoff of these work groups for the 1st of next month. We will strive for that. They're taking bets in Las Vegas, and probably on the whole bidding against are getting started by that date. But it's good to have these targets to move you along. And I think it's safe to say that in a February, in a circa February timeframe, we will be getting these work groups off the ground. So this moves us along to our presentation in our seminar series today by Mike Dorsch. And as you will see in a moment when he stands up, for those of you who don't know him, this in fact is a picture of Mike. We haven't always gotten this right, but we got it right. This time. Before we do move into Mike's presentation, and we're very much looking forward to that, would anyone like to make any comments or suggestions about the evolution of the Collaboratory and the work groups, or anything of that nature? If you would like to stand up and declare your interest in leading a work group, you're welcome to do that at this time as well. Okay, yeah. If you'll go up to the microphone, that would be great.
This is Sergey Surinam. I'm Division of Nephrology, and I work at the Kidney Epidemiology and Cost Center, and I'm interested in kidney epidemiology, chronic disease epidemiology, and surveillance and prevention. So I'd like to volunteer for the funding group, the group that is seeking funding, and I'd like to be a volunteer to contribute to the leadership if so chosen.
Thank you, Reggie. Sign him up. Sign him up. You all heard it, folks. Okay. Thank you. Any other comments, expressions of volunteerism, or other sentiments? Okay. Thank you. Not hearing any further at this time. Let's move on. I think, as some of you know, tend to opt for very brief introductions, allowing the speaker then, because the speaker is much more capable than I am of talking about, in this case, his own interests. I will introduce Mike Dorsch very briefly to say that he's a clinical associate professor in the College of Pharmacy and a clinical pharmacist at Michigan Medicine, based in the Cardiovascular Center. His research interests go directly to the topic of this talk. He's interested in mobile health and cardiovascular disease. As I think everyone knows, these first two seminars are emphasizing our grantees in our small grants program. Last time we heard from Skip Campbell and Greta Crapol about their work with the Michigan Surgical Quality Collaborative and the small grant to scale that up to the nation and the world and the moon. Now today we'll be hearing broadly about Mike's interests and specifically about the work he's going to be doing with his small grant. So Mike, thank you. We very much appreciate your presentation.
Recording is on.
Test, test. Very good. Thank you, guys. Is it? Just turn the volume on. Yep, yep. You have a few meetings. This one here? There you go.
All right, thanks a lot, guys, and thanks LHS for giving me the opportunity to talk today. I did get to pull the Michigan Medicine picture to put on my slides today, but I did not get to pull the actual slide deck that they have to offer. So I don't know if you guys have been to the website, but there's a lot of cool stuff like sample slide decks and templates and things like that for the new Michigan Medicine moniker. So start off with my disclosures. Some of the granting agencies and research support that I have. Just to say one word, if anybody does have funding from AHRQ currently and would like to talk about AHRQ, I'd be happy to talk to you after this a little bit. We're having a couple of problems with AHRQ, and I'd love to talk to someone who knows more about AHRQ. The next disclosure is I'm a father of a Girl Scout. It is that. Oh, Agency for Health Quality Research, Health Research and Quality. So it is the time of year for Girl Scout cookies. So if anyone's interested in that, you can see me after as well. I've been hitting up all my colleagues this morning in my office. And if saying I'm a father is not good enough, there is my Girl Scout, and with her order form. And she's very cute, right? So you can't pass that up, right? So I thought I'd start with that. So here's the objectives for today. If you came to this talk to hear about mobile echocardiogram or patches for ECGs, I'm sorry. That's not going to be the focus of my talk. I realized when I gave the topic, it was very broad because there were a lot of things that I was thinking about talking about. But I'm really going to focus on the smartphone or the mobile device and wearables today. I'm not going to focus on, if you're into that kind of stuff, you know, in cardiology, there are tons of mobile technologies that are not a smartphone or a wearable device. And there's a lot of things going on in that realm that I'm interested in, but I'm not going to talk about today, just to keep it under 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about briefly a care model that actually I took from Larry On that kind of lends itself really well to mobile technologies and kind of talk through that a little bit. And then I'm going to discuss two cases. And they're two cases on purpose because of the two major research projects that I'm working on right now and grants that I have around mobile technology and cardiovascular disease. One is around using geofencing technology to help patients reduce their sodium intake, and the other is about remote monitoring in heart failure patients. The latter of the two is the one that we're working with LHS on for the LHS grant. So if you guys keep up with the news, on Monday was the 10th anniversary that Steve Jobs announced the first iPhone, which I will admit that I guess I should have disclosed I'm a huge Apple fanboy. But the first iPhone really was technologically the biggest advancement that we'd seen in a long time in mobile technologies, and really lends itself well to doing a lot of different types of research. And just to give you an idea of what mobile devices offer, because I don't know if everybody fully appreciates everything that mobile devices offer from a healthcare and research standpoint. They have probably more advanced cameras than many cameras that you would buy on the shelf. The display is actually on my phone is better than the display that I have on my desk, right? I don't know if anybody else has that, but the display on my phone and my iPad is better than the display that I have on my desk that I use every day. GPS and the Russian equivalent as well, when put together, can tell where you are within 2 meters, right? That's pretty awesome. Wireless technologies, LTE, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, near field communication, it's pretty much standard in all smartphones. I'm not talking about iPhone specifically here. Almost all phones are now coming with fingerprint sensors. Android and Samsung is getting on that bandwagon as well. Gyroscopes and accelerometers to tell how the phone's moving and how you're moving, and how fast things are going. Proximity sensors to other things, ambient light sensors, barometers, so we know how high you are, right? Microphones, so we can test your voice. Memory, to store all that information, and microprocessors that are really, really advanced microprocessors. So if you sit and think about this, all of these things put together really offer researchers a way to do pretty much anything they want. And if you sat down and thought about it for a minute, you could probably think of 3 or 4 things you want to do with just a mobile phone, right? So you think about a camera. What if you're taking pictures of a mole, right? And you're taking a picture of that mole and you're monitoring it over time, and there's some sort of program in the background that monitors that, and using imaging technology or artificial intelligence sees if that is getting bigger and can tell in reference to other things that when you're taking a picture of it, how big it is. There's a whole bunch of those things that you can use in the mobile device. And which is astounding to me, I don't know if there's anybody in the room that's actually worked on the Cray 2 supercomputer. Has anybody heard of or worked on the Cray 2 supercomputer? You worked on one? Oh, you heard, okay, I was gonna say, you worked on one, wow. So 1985 was the most advanced supercomputer, right? 1985 is equivalent to the iPhone 4 as far as processor speed, which was, the iPhone 4 were on 7, right? So that was 3 years ago. So the processing power in these devices, and they have so many things you can use them for, it's kind of hard not to use the device. Granted, there are other things that go to the device that are important, but the devices are really important. Just to give you a sense of that, I don't know if you guys have heard of ResearchKit. ResearchKit is something that Apple developed that is a way to help researchers gather data from patients that's a little bit more streamlined, not perfect, but a little bit more streamlined. And they've created activity tasks that go along with ResearchKit and can be done in mobile apps. The thing that, I don't want to talk too much about ResearchKit, but you can see on here that the actual tasks that you have that are motor activity tasks, fitness tasks, cognition, are directly linked to the sensors that are in the phone and then linked to data that can be collected. So there's a lot of stuff. This is just the initial set of things that Apple created, but like I said, if you sat down, we sat down together maybe and talked about it, I'm sure we could come up with things that are on the phone that you could use to do this. We're talking about using a way to use the vibration on a phone to do neuropathy testing, right? Like there's some really cool stuff that could be done if you just think about all the stuff that's there. Mobile devices aren't going away. This is data from Cisco about how much of an increase in mobile devices we're going to see over the next few years from 15 to 20. And you can see the biggest change here at the top as far as billions of devices. The biggest changes are going to be in smartphones, which are at the bottom, and M2M, which is mobile to mobile. So mostly wearable devices, smart watches, and those sorts of things. And if you look at exabytes of data, I'm told, I don't know for sure, but an exabyte, 5 exabytes is, if you would write down every word in a human language on text, that's 5 exabytes. And so you can think about in 2015, that's how much we were using, and it's going to go up exponentially in 2020. So we're going to be using mobile. The mobile devices aren't going to go away. Smartphones and these wearable devices are the ones that are going to kind of take over as far as the amount of usage that we have. And we are in probably the best country to do research in mobile and in mobile health. There's the GSMA has a connectivity index. We have the highest connectivity index in the United States compared to other countries. While some of the issues here in the middle, we may not be the top of. If you went and looked it up, we may not be the top of infrastructure or the top of consumer or affordability. But if you put our index score together, we're the top in the world. But we do have a very good infrastructure for mobile technologies. It's affordable. Consumers are using them, and lots of content availability in the United States. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with that. The Pew Research Center puts out information about smartphones. They do a survey of smartphones, and they looked at smartphone ownership, and about 64% of their survey sample actually had smartphones. So we say that's pretty much a representative sample of the U.S. adult population. So around 64% of U.S. adults have smartphones. So when people come back to me and say, why is your research in smartphones? Not everybody has a smartphone. Well, in 2015, 64%, and it's growing. As you know, it's growing. I remember 2 years ago, we were at graduation for the College of Pharmacy, and I was sitting there, and as students were walking up, I turned around and looked, and there are grandparents with iPads holding them up, taking pictures, just like you took a picture in the beginning, holding them up, and grandparents taking pictures of their iPads. So smartphone use is dramatically going up. There is some disparity when you look at various areas here, like age and income and things like that, but that stuff's going to go away over time. Things are going to get cheaper, and as younger people get older, smartphones are going to be more available. The other interesting thing that the Pew Research found out was that one of the top thing that people use their phone for was to get information about health conditions. So 62% of people said they use their phone to get information about their healthcare conditions. So I thought that was rather interesting. And it also had this idea of a little bit of disparity when it comes to age. But keep that in mind that the 20-year-olds are going to be 30-year-olds, and they're going to be 40-year-olds. And so over time, we're going to get more and more people using smartphones. So I'm going to briefly touch on a care model. This is, I give all the credit to this picture to Larry Ahn, but I think it's really important and kind of sets the stage for some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So many of you know the current state of care where patients and families are at home. They actually come to clinic, the ED or the hospital to get their care. They may come into the hospital and get triaged to a rehab facility or a skilled nursing facility and then get back home, or have a complication and get readmitted to the hospital. And so it's this vicious cycle. And there's this idea that really fits well with the learning health system that we should maybe make a shift towards more care at home. It's better for the patients, it's better for the healthcare system. And the idea is that if you can have them in their home, get more and more information in their home, provide them with knowledge and an action plan based on that information, that we can have a connected team that can interact with patients in their home. Maybe some care can be provided in their home that would have been provided in the healthcare system previously. And that may make it an easier transition for people, and maybe able to triage people better to rehab facilities, skilled nursing, hospitals, EDs. in clinics if we have that information. So I think this lends itself well to some of the things I'm going to talk about with mobile health technology. I'm going to briefly kind of give you a background of cardiovascular disease. I'm sure that you're all well familiar with how prevalent cardiovascular disease in the United States. It's one of the most prevalent diseases. As you get older, everybody gets it, right? I mean, if you look at 80 plus, 85% of the United States has cardiovascular disease. Very prevalent. Deaths due to cardiovascular disease. I think overall deaths for cancer are still just past cardiovascular disease, but we're still fighting to be the most deadly disease in the United States. But as you get older, the deaths from cardiovascular disease is significantly higher. The Million Hearts Initiative was actually an initiative that came out because of that information. The Department of Health and Human Services came out with an initiative called the Million Hearts to prevent 1 million heart attacks and strokes in 5 years. And this started in 2011. And they had a really basic thought process. If we do the ABCs, right, then we will reduce those events. And the ABCs were giving aspirin to people when appropriate, blood pressure control, cholesterol management, and smoking cessation, okay? So I'm gonna talk about, in prevention, I'm gonna talk about one of these. I'm really interested in cardiovascular risk and assessment and getting people on appropriate medications. So I don't think a pharmacist can go through a talk without having drugs in a slide. So I have 2 drugs in the slide, aspirin and statin, I'm really passionate about, but I'm really gonna focus the next part of this talk on sodium intake and blood pressure control. So the evil slide, especially right after lunch, is the nutrition facts that is on every box, right? And all of you know that at the top there's this serving size, and then the calories per serving, and nutrients that you want to limit, and then nutrients that you want to get enough of, right? And that's sort of the quick and dirty. But one of the limiting ones is sodium, right? And so, as a show of hands, sodium intake per serving, 160 milligrams. Is it low or high? So low, raise your hand. High, raise your hand. You don't know, raise your hand. Right, there's a lot of people that don't know. So some of the research that's been done in the area in sodium is pretty much around 120 or less is considered low. And that's, I'm using it as a green, that green is good. 120 to 480 is kind of in the middle zone. And then really high sodium containing foods is around 480 milligrams of sodium per serving. So just keep that in mind, because I'm going to come back to this in a minute, because you guys are not any different from your answers to patients that we actually talk to. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
I'm a geneticist, and certainly in animals, we know that there are salt-sensitive hypertensive rats and not salt-sensitive hypertension. And it was my impression that this whole issue of salt being bad for you, I'm a geneticist, I study human variability, right? That's a variable thing, that only some people are salt sensitive, and most people can have a lot of salt at no harm. Is this considered a rule or recommendation for everyone, irrespective of your genetic makeup or
My next probably 5 or 6 slides will tell you that it's probably, there is salt-sensitive hypertension. Some of my colleagues, Scott's not in the room, Scott Hummel, who I work with on this research, can probably speak more eloquently about salt-sensitive hypertension than I can. But I'll show you the data. It's pretty compelling that sodium is really important. Yeah, for everyone. So this is data from England. And why this is so cool and why I included it is that they actually did an intervention in their country because they thought that there were a lot of deaths due to cardiovascular disease, and they wanted to do an intervention over time and then monitor that, sort of like we do in the US with NHANES. They monitored over time people's sodium intake. And you can see here over time, as they did their intervention, that as sodium or salt intake, the way they report is in salt intake, went down, blood pressure went down significantly over time, and their mortality rates from ischemic heart disease and stroke also went down. Now, granted, this was a big thing for them, and they implemented a bunch of other things to reduce these events, but I think the sodium and the blood pressure is a really important link that has been done and been shown in other research as well. just to give you some more background, this is a meta-analysis of sodium intake of greater than 2,300 milligrams of sodium, showing a significant increase in incident cardiovascular disease. This was shown across a number of clinical trials. And then just to link that with cardiovascular disease mortality, there's actually a meta-analysis. This did not use a 2,300 milligram cutoff, but each study had their own definition of a cutoff, but showed an increased risk of cardiovascular mortality in patients based on their sodium intake. So higher sodium intake, more cardiovascular disease, and more cardiovascular mortality. This is a graph that shows the United States intake of sodium on average. So it's from NHANES. They do surveys of people and look at sodium intake. And the average sodium intake in the United States is around 3,400 milligrams of sodium. If you look at the black line, that is 2,400 milligrams. That is what the American Heart Association recommends that everyone stay under. So if you think about 2,300 milligrams of sodium, around 86 to 90% of the United States does not reduce their sodium enough, okay, for what the AHA recommends. And in fact, the AHA, the first statement is less than 2,300 milligrams. The second statement is, but if you can get less than 1,500 milligrams, you should, right? And so the red line is 1,500 milligrams, and I'm sure that's less than 5% of the US that's there. So this is a picture from the AHA, but too much sodium. In the United States, we were around 300 or 3,400 milligrams of sodium, the average intake, okay? The recommended sodium intake is around 1,500 if you can do it. So where does that sodium come from? In the United States, maybe not for you guys in the crowd, but from the United States in general, that comes from restaurants and grocery stores for the most part. And to show you that, this is a graph that's from the AHA statistics from last year, just looking at the change in habits of our food expenditure from 1977 to 2007. Basically, focus on the red and the blue. So the blue is foods at home, the red is foods when you're eating out, right? So eating out went up, foods at home went down, okay? And just to give you a sense of that, in the United States, about half people go out to restaurants 1 to 3 times per week. Around 23% of people eat out greater than or equal to 4 times per week, okay? That's the national average. And about 77% of sodium intake comes from processed foods and restaurant foods. So I have some restaurants here I was going to show you. What do you think? Chili's. What do you think about number? So if you went to Chili's and just ordered a meal and didn't get a drink and didn't get any other sides, what's the average amount of sodium that comes in a meal that you would get when you wouldn't order any of that other stuff at Chili's? What's that? You almost got it, right? 2,522. That's the average. So I took all of them and averaged them up, and that's what it is. What do you think about Burger King? So this is Burger King just looking at not a meal choice, just a sandwich choice at Burger King. Well, you guys are a little over. Not quite as bad. But if you add in, oh, I'm going to get a drink, that's not a diet drink, and I'm going to get, whatever other things people might get, fries, add maybe some chicken tenders on top of their burger, whatever it is. It's pretty high. Some of us think Panera Bread's really awesome, right? I don't know if you guys do, but we like to go to Panera. It's easy with the kids, right? What do you think about Panera? 600? Actually surprising. I will tell you, you go to a restaurant like Chili's, and you look at the, you guys have seen this, 550 calorie menu, right? And then you look at the sodium intake of the 550 calorie menu, you will be shocked. The 550 calorie menu does not help you in your sodium intake. I can guarantee you that. What about Subway? We always think Subway eat fresh, right? What's the average? Now, if you go to Subway and you're like, I'm going to get a tuna, a 6-inch tuna, right? Or I'm going to get the 6-inch veggie, this is not going to be you. But if you go there and get a 6-inch, you're looking at around 900 milligrams of sodium in one sandwich. That's not the chips that go with it. That's not anything else you get with it. That's what you get from one sandwich, okay? Now, keep in mind, this is the average, right? There are things at these restaurants that you can pick that are good from a sodium standpoint. So what are the high sodium-containing foods? Just to give you a sense, focus on the right side of this. It's breads, chicken. Most chicken, if you go to the grocery store, is injected with sodium. If you get fresh chicken, it's actually, when you take it home and you cook it, a lot of it's got sodium in it already. Pizza, which I would guess if I asked you guys, you would have said pizza was number one. Pastas, cold cuts have a lot of sodium in them. Condiments, Mexican dishes, and the like. Cheese is another big one. And patients cannot estimate their sodium intake. This is actually a study on a nutrition journal where they ask people, what's your daily intake of sodium, right? You can tell that they're way below the average, so they're not even close to guessing it. And 35% of people didn't even know what their intake of sodium is. In fact, when we do focus groups and we start talking about sodium, many people don't even know. People that have hypertension don't even know that they should be following a low sodium diet. So what do we find out from patients in our focus groups around sodium? They really struggle with picking low sodium options in restaurants. They think restaurants don't serve low sodium foods, which I just proved to you that they probably don't, although there's some in each restaurant that you can probably pick. Patients really have a low confidence. This is hypertensive patients, a low confidence in actually picking low sodium options. They actually are worse than you at telling if an item has low sodium. So I did that same exercise with a group of patients, and 100% of them guessed wrong whether it was low sodium or not, just looking at a label. So labels are not good enough, at least right now. And then patients have low confidence in estimating what they eat every day from a sodium standpoint. So this is a grant that we're working on right now. We're creating an intervention. It's just a mobile application. We're using geofencing, which I'll explain in the next slide, to alert patients when they go into restaurants around low sodium options. We're giving them options to scan their foods. And then we're working with their top 5, based on a sodium screener, their top 5 sodium containing foods. We're developing messaging right now. I think we're done with that part of the grant for first aim, and then we're working on getting the app done so we can study it in the clinical trial. So just to give you a sense of geofencing and how that might be applicable to some of your research if you're in the field. So this is McDonald's, right? You walk up to McDonald's and you say to yourself, what can I eat that's low sodium McDonald's, right? I think I don't think there is any restaurant that I've walked into that you can easily do this. A lot of restaurants are implementing calories on their menus, but from a sodium standpoint, it's not necessarily there. So what we do is we put some sort of fence around the McDonald's based on their latitude and longitude. And we're working through some of these issues now where you set up this fence, and then you provide them with a just-in-time alert, a contextual alert that says, hey, don't worry, you can eat out and still watch your sodium, right? And then what that does, when they click into it, it gives them a restaurant name at the top that allows them to search into the items for that restaurant. So they can click on this middle part here. They can click and go in to look at them, and then it gives them the 3 lowest sodium alternatives for that restaurant. And at the bottom here, there's this little tip. Depending on the restaurant, it could have some tip information for them, like adding vegetables like onions might improve taste, but not actually add any sodium. The other part that we think is important from intervention is when people go to the grocery store and scan items, there'll be a scanning function, and they'll get direct feedback about whether that's a good or a bad low sodium option. If it's a bad low sodium option, it would actually give them alternatives. These are mock-ups of what the app will look like, but you can see here on the right, if it's a bad sodium option, there'll be 3 alternatives that are within that category of food that they could select. And hopefully soon, in the next few months, we'll be able to start the study. We're looking at the clinical effectiveness of this as well in various forms with urinary sodium, which is a measurement of dietary intake of sodium and blood pressure. And then we'll look at some novel measurements that we think might be interesting from a mobile health standpoint of patients actually monitoring their own urinary sodium at home using some dipsticks. Next, I'm going to focus on heart failure, and this is where it leads into the LHS grant that we have. But heart failure is very prevalent. It's around 6 million people in the United States, around 900 new cases every year. This is data from last year's AHA statistics. Around 1 million hospitalizations every year, and about 50% of people die in 5 years on average with the disease. So a progressive disease. And it's probably one of the more costly diseases and probably linked directly to hospitalizations. around $30 billion. That's expected to dramatically increase to $70 billion by 2030. So anything that we can do to improve this would be helpful for the healthcare system, especially now that we may or may not have a Obamacare Affordable Care Act. So heart failure self-management is really important. Just to get you guys an idea of what self-management is for heart failure, if you haven't heard of it, it's an active cognitive process taken by the patient to manage their heart failure. So we have heart failure patients do self-monitoring. They look at their weights, their sodium intake, fluid intake, and symptoms, and then they interpret that and do some self-management. So this is a standard across the board for patients with chronic diseases, especially with heart failure. And a few years ago, we developed a mobile a website application actually to help patients with their self-monitoring and did a study around that. It was a prospective single center, single group study where we looked at pre and post study endpoints, enrolled patients in the CVC and had patients do self-monitoring for 12 weeks. No intervention other than they monitored their disease and saw the results of that disease, of their disease, and they could see that over time on this website. We looked at the outcomes for the study were heart failure status, so NYHA class, which is a functional classification for patients with heart failure. The Minnesota Living with Heart Failure questionnaire is a quality of life questionnaire in patients with heart failure. We measured their weight, exercise, patient-reported exercise, patient-reported walk distance, and physical exam, which was done by a heart failure cardiologist at baseline and follow-up. This is just an example of the questions that they answered every day. There were other questions and other self-monitoring that they could have done. These were required. They could have also monitored their fluid intake, their sodium intake, their blood pressure, their heart rate. It was not required. But every day they received these questions and could see graphs of the results over time. The age was right around 60 years old, so similar to an average heart failure patient. Most of them were men. Ejection fraction is 28, so pretty good patient population from a heart failure progression standpoint. Around 20% had ICDs, which is pretty standard in clinical practice, and had some other cardiovascular diseases. So what we saw was from baseline to follow-up, NYHA classification, so goes from 1 to 4, 4 being the worst, right? From a functional status, it's the worst. They were around 2.5 at baseline and went down to about a 2 at follow-up. So significant improvement in NYHA classification at the follow-up. And Minnesota Living with Heart Failure score is the same way. So the higher is the worse quality of life. So in the beginning, they were around a 55, went down to about a 42. So an improvement in their quality of life from baseline to follow-up. And so what that led us to, and we also looked at some of the other parameters that were not statistically significant, but from a clinical standpoint, we really thought were significant. So they dropped about 2 pounds over the 12 weeks just by doing the self-monitoring. Exercise improved, walk distance improved. Those are all patient-reported outcomes. The physician physical exam signs of heart failure, so JVD is a sign of volume overload, jugular venous distension, improved, so it went down, so less volume overloaded. And then peripheral edema is a sign of volume overload as well, improved. So that was a standardized from a physical exam. While not statistically significant, we thought those things were really important, that they all went in the same direction, and they improved. So this led us to saying, wow, we should do this in a broader context. And at the same time, mobile devices were getting more advanced. And so the current strategy was, in patient care was, patients do self-monitoring. They actively monitor themselves. They look for clinical worsening, and then they perform self-management, right? And then the healthcare team kind of augments that by calling them and talking to them on the phone. What we think is a future strategy, and one thing that we're really interested in trying to study, is augmenting that active monitoring with some of the things that we've done, some of the questions we've used in our this website, and then throwing in some passive monitoring using wearable devices. So for weights from a scale, a remote scale, steps and sleep patterns, and then coming up with preclinical measurements of a clinical worsening, and then trying to put all of that together to give patients a graph that they can see that actually shows the progress of their disease. And then in the future, push notifications that can help them modify their disease or change their behavior. And that would be their self-management. And then also being augmented by the healthcare team. So our focus really is on patient-centric. Questions we've gotten a lot is, what about the healthcare provider? Because in this model, we're really ignoring the healthcare provider, and we understand the healthcare provider is really important. Obviously, some of us in the room are healthcare providers. We like to think we're actually helping patients, but we're focusing on patients first, with the idea that eventually if things don't work with patients, or there might be some things that providers might need that patients don't need. So we're definitely cognizant of the provider part of this. And just to show you kind of a picture of how this works, I don't know if some of you have seen this with heart failure, but heart failure is really a progressive disease, and this health status just kind of goes down. So this would be initially when they get diagnosed, then their first hospital admission. They get better during the first hospital admission, go home, and then they get worse over time. And it's the same sort of gradual drop in health status. And so the idea pictorially of adaptive mobile technologies is that we can thwart that off. We're not going to prevent them from ever getting readmitted, but maybe we can push it out 6 months or 3 months from their previous admission and make their life a little bit better. So we're in the process of developing a mobile application that incorporates many aspects of the website. We're actually adding into the application passive remote monitoring, and we're working on motivational messages for that application. And we're working with LHS around the motivational messages and creating a predictive model of clinical worsening by using some of these preclinical markers with wearable devices. So conclusion, mobile technologies offer a chance to collect a lot of different data in patients' environments at home. It gives research access to the data that we haven't really collected previously and don't really know a whole lot about. GPS and geofencing is a promising technology for just-in-time contextual messages and interventions. And wearable devices may offer a key to preclinical states in some chronic diseases. As you guys probably know, many people are working on in that area. Just some special thanks. Todd Coling and Scott Hummel, cardiologists in heart failure that I work with a lot. Larry Ahn, head of CHCR, has worked with us a lot. The groups of CHCR are awesome. Rex is in the room, who's the boss, but Emerson, our project manager, Kristen, who does a lot of design, Juan, who does a lot of the technology, coding, and Diane, who's done a lot of our messages, have been great to work with. So special thanks to them. And I'll take any questions you have. Yeah, so that's a good question. The question, I don't know if everybody heard it, but it's, what kind of efforts are being done at the FDA level and pushing the FDA to make some requirements for food manufacturers. I don't know if you noticed the whole green, yellow, red thing that I kind of brought up a couple times, which is what we like, has actually been used a lot, okay? And so if you look at Europe has done some things where they've sort of required that people do this green, yellow, red moniker, so that when you look at a food, you pick it up, you don't have to scan it. It's got sodium, green, yellow, red, cholesterol, green, yellow, red, calories, green, yellow, red. I know that the new director of the FDA is a cardiologist. I know that he is really keen on this stuff, so I don't know. I know the FDA is looking at it because I just saw something a couple weeks ago about the FDA and sodium intake. I don't know what's going to come of it, especially with any focus on deregulation, because that would be more regulation. But I think it's good. I mean, I think that clearly people cannot read what's on a box, right? Even educated people cannot look at a box. Like if I didn't do this research, I wouldn't know which boxes are high sodium, when I go to the grocery store. So there needs to be something. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. Is this one? Yeah? Patty Abbott, School of Nursing. Great talk. Enjoyed it a lot. I'm wondering if you've had any sense yet, or if you have seen or heard or read about that balance between using data to empower patients, whether it's empowering or obligating, because we've seen a lot of patients that are not into wearing the sensors. They don't have a Fitbit. They don't want a smartwatch. It's just one more thing they have to do. I was just wondering if you've seen any of that or have any opinions.
I haven't. I haven't seen any data, right, to support. But clearly, there are patients like that. And we've done focus groups with hypertensive patients, and we've done one-on-one interviews with heart failure patients. And with our heart failure patients, we've talked a lot about devices and what can we do to help you. And there's clear divides. You know, when you ask people, we were asking them about what can the healthcare team do to help you do self-management. And there's clearly people that say nothing. There's nothing you can do to help me, right? So there's going to be people, I think, across the spectrum for that. And I think wearables are getting more and more into people's, you know, idea of things to do. So, but there's going to be clearly other avenues. Like, I don't think what we're doing is necessarily going to be the one, you know, one size fit all for everyone. There's clearly other technologies, and we might have to do is make a bunch of different technologies available to patients, like IVR, which is phone-based interview or questions, and other sorts of things as well.
Well, I don't have a mic, but I'll just yell. I'm good at that. I'm also thinking about that not only from the patient side, but from the provider side as well. So when I start to look at, as a clinician, when I start to look at the Internet of Things and the slew of data that now is coming into potentially an EHR or something, I'm seeing a lot of providers that are also pushing back, saying, I'm not sure of the validity of that data. There is so much of it. And so then again, it becomes this trade-off between empowerment and obligation. And I think, you know, I think you're spot on with what you're doing. I think it's incredibly important because I personally feel that a informed patient makes for a stronger patient-provider relationship, but at the same time, we're trying to figure out that weird balance in the middle. So challenging work.
And that's actually one of the reasons why we're not focusing on providers up front. There are other reasons, but that's one of them we've talked about, is that, you know, what does a step count of 9,000 mean, you know? And how do you alert a provider of that? Or, you know, if there's one night they're sleeping 2 hours and the other night they're sleeping 8 hours, what does that mean? When should a provider enter? You know, we have this already in cardiology where we have people with ICDs, implanted ICDs that have data on them around movement, and some of them have data on thoracic impedance. You can't even get to that data unless you're a provider that goes into a portal that's not our portal, the company's portal, puts in the patient's information, then downloads the information in a PDF, right? And then you know how much physical activity the patient may have, and maybe their thoracic impedance, and if they had ICD shocks and other things. So there's a lot of challenges on the provider end. I agree with you. We need to move forward, and eventually there might be some sort of green, yellow, red thing for providers too. I don't know, but.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, my name's Andy. I'm a graduate student research assistant, assisting with mobile health in ISR. So literature shows that about 75% of mobile apps, on average, are abandoned by the 10th use. What engagement strategies are you implementing in your application to address this concern?
Well, so the nice thing is that they're in a study, right? And so that's the first thing, is usually you're going to get better than that in a study because you're going to have people watching them. So looking at the actual effectiveness of a mobile application, you want people to use it, so you're going to have people following up to make sure people use it. Now, then the next step is, how do they use it in real life? We plan on in the studies we're doing, getting information back from patients about their use, not only just the technical stuff like did they click on a notification and that kind of stuff, but a survey at the end about how they feel, you know, about how many messages they got, and did they like that, did they want more, did they want less, so that when we ultimately get out to thousands of people like mobile apps are, and where the data you're quoting is from, that we don't have that. But clearly that, I mean, I'm just as guilty as anybody. You know, I download an app and within 2 days, it annoys me, like by too many notifications, or it doesn't do enough for me, right? So I just get rid of it. So I agree with your sentiment that we need to do something about it to make it The other thing that we've kind of talked about, and CHCR is really great at this, is thinking about what can we do to customize for the patient. Like, can they do something in their settings that changes their user experience that helps them be more engaged? Maybe that's number of notifications per day on max, or times a day where you give them notifications so it matches up with their meal times and that kind of stuff. We've talked about that, but I don't know if there's a silver bullet for what you're saying. Are you speaking with New Year's resolutions?
Hi, Mike. I'm curious to know about the types of motivational messages that you and your team are developing, and what are some processes used to develop those messages?
Yeah, so we've, in general, have used focus groups. We've done, I think it's 4 focus groups. We've only done the focus groups in the with the sodium app first, where I think our heart failure focus groups are going to start in February, right around February 1st. And so for the sodium app, we actually stepped back because we didn't think we knew enough to create messages. So we actually did a couple of focus groups where we just talked to them about sodium. We had some questionnaires we asked them, so we got some information about their confidence with sodium, and we actually asked them questions about, sodium intake, where they taken their sodium, that kind of stuff, which gained us some information to create a list of messages that we then asked patients whether they liked them or not. The heart failure focus groups that we're going to do, we're flipping a little bit because we think we know a lot about patients. We've done some one-on-one interviews with patients. We've done a lot of educational things, and we actually worked with, Todd Coling worked with Bosch on a product that they had that he created a bunch of messages for already. So we're actually going to go into those with messages and try to get people to react to those messages and tell us which ones are good or which ones are bad, which ones would motivate them. So that's sort of our process. 2 different processes depending on what you have.
Actually, yeah, building on that question, so the focus groups help you in the development. What's your process of sort of measuring what's actually working and not working, and I guess what's your continuous improvement process, or what's your process for learning what's working and not working and then improving upon it?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question, and I'll actually add to that. In any app that's healthcare related, what is the actual feature that is improving the outcome, right? And so that's something that I worry about every day, or not every day, but when I'm thinking about my research. So I think that's what part of what your question is what's the feature that actually doing it?
I'm in the Department of Learning Health Science.
Yep.
So we're always about learning,
Yep.
continuous improvement.
So for the heart failure thing, we're actually we're trying to do it in a stepwise fashion that actually can show us some of these things. So our first grant that we have right now is actually just a health status indicator. So they're going to answer questions. They're going to get a health status indicator so that we can identify, does a health status indicator improve outcomes? Our next step is going to be adding on messages on top of that and looking at messages and which messages might be beneficial, and then we're working through that process. So that is something I worry about a lot. We're starting with this health status indicator to see if that feature is something that is worthwhile and people viewing their data. But I agree with you. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had seen the news this week about the Joint Commission banning text messaging,
I did not see that.
specifically for patient care orders. I just thought there's so much research on the impact of how beneficial it is and how well patients respond to text messaging, and to have the Joint Commission ban this is problematic.
That is interesting that they banned that because we do a lot of messaging, right, through text. I mean, I don't know if their definition of text messaging is mobile phone to mobile phone, but how many people that are providers use the portal and message their patients, right? I mean, people do that to streamline care, so. Yeah.
So this is going to sound a little more challenging than I mean it
Okay.
to sound. But another thing we worry about is scale and scalability of things we do. And I accept the negative health consequences of sodium. But there are also negative health consequences to carbs, to excessive use of alcohol, to a number of other things, and I could, go on, that you can do that are bad for you. How do we go from a bad for you by bad for you, siloed kind of way of thinking about this, to something that can scale in a way that the next thing that's bad for you that we want to create an intervention for does not create as much overhead on your life as the previous one? In other words, how can we scale this efficiently?
Yeah, so I think I could go a place, 30 years from now with that question. But I think
as far as you need to go.
Yeah, but the intermediary step is, in my mind, and maybe there's a bunch of negatives to this, right? But in my mind, it's some sort of, in my siloed world, app store for health that patients can get into, and things can be easily done where they're prescribed to them and can add some of these things onto that. Now, the 30-year from now thing that I think that's maybe a step towards this is, how do we have a framework that works for everyone, right? And we just add things to a patient, to their EMR, or whatever it is, to give them these things, whatever things they need. Whether, boom, here's your feature for self-monitoring for your heart failure, because you now have heart failure, and here's your sodium, intervention because you're a heart failure patient and needs sodium intervention as well. And then there's a bunch of those sorts of things that you could think about. Now, there's a whole lot of, going from now to then is a lot of work.
Hi, I'm Ann Sales. I'm also in the Department of Learning Health Sciences. And I'd actually like to just push back a little bit and suggest that one way to think, well, there are two issues. One, I think there's a siloing by disease issue, which is to say this is about heart failure. Well, yeah, lots of people with heart failure also have diabetes. They also have, like 3 other things. And that, I think, becomes very unscalable for the individual. But I also think there's this sort of the flip side of the messaging about what's good for you. And I was really struck when the latest round of discussion about how badly we display information about nutrition was, the counter to that was what Brazil is doing, which is to say, here are the things that are good for you. And basically anything that's a whole food, like an apple or an orange or, a piece of vegetable that doesn't have a label on it at all might actually be the place to start. And I wonder if that's one way to think about the sort of the scaling issue, is to focus less on the what you should avoid. Although I completely I mean, the geofencing I think is a fantastic idea, and we do know that in this country people spend a lot of their time and energy eating outside of their own homes, so that I think helps a lot. But I think it's how do you then push the message in a way that sort of the next iteration for those people perhaps who have been using an app like the one you're talking about might start to get them on a more holistic towards health kind of model.
Yeah, because the only way to go to that point is, the only way you can actually reduce your sodium in today's society is actually to do that, is to eat whole foods, that are not pre-prepared. And when you do that, in fact, Scott's working on some papers where he's going to talk about this, but there's other papers that have shown this. When you actually do lower your sodium intake, you actually lose weight because there's, calories are lower in foods that have lower sodium, right? So people actually end up losing weight.
One of the things to be careful of is creating new kinds of stigma associated with it, which then creates anxiety responses to the trigger and impairs the patient acceptance or response or compliance with the behavior change. You see that a lot with obesity and triggers related to high-fat foods or people who are obese but don't overeat, getting paranoid about being seen eating at all. You see it with people who have lung cancer and the stigma associated with smoking, and you have so many non-smokers with lung cancer who are beaten over the head about their smoking habits when they've never smoked. And there's this assumption that they must have been smokers or they must be lying. So there's this risk of how to handle the communications in that context. I could very easily see sugar and salt moving into that category of creating new problems through the communications around them.
Yeah, we've actually heard patients say that around when they go out to dinner with their family or when they go over to places for parties, that's when they struggle because they don't want to ask for different foods or they don't want to ask for a different menu at a restaurant. They don't want to be seen different, right? So there's all those social issues that go along with it. Yeah, it's a great point.
Okay, Rajiv, we'll give you the last comment. We're coming up on time, so a quick question.
Yeah, quick question is regarding information overload and also the association of obsessively looking at your cell phone or social media or connectivity with mental illness triggers, perhaps anxiety generating and so on. How do you balance all that in thinking about what you do?
That is a question I don't know if I have a really good answer to, because I struggle myself with it, right? I mean, I'm always like walking, trying to get my email deleted and, doing stuff. So, we're trying not to overload people with messages. We're thinking very hard with CHR about the messages themselves and how often they're going to be coming and what they're going to say. The messages are very I didn't show more than one of them, but I can tell you they're really uplifting, not negative messages. So they do a really good job with that.
So, Mike, thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks to everyone here for coming, and also for the terrific questions that you asked and the terrific answers that you gave. Take care. We'll see you next time.